So my name's Ross Andrews. I'm 51 years old, so that makes me an elderly epidemiologist. Thank you, Tom Snelling. When I talk about immunisation in pregnancy or flu vaccination in pregnancy, this is frequently the kind of response that I get. And it was actually, to be honest, it was kind of my response initially when Helen asked me if I could talk about the benefits. So I'm not a clinician, I am an epidemiologist, I'm a numbers man, so I am going to bombard you with numbers, so hold on to your seat. What I'm really going to talk to you about is predominantly about a FluMum study. So this is a study that is a study looking to see if women vaccinated in pregnancy have less influenza in their infants than the women who weren't vaccinated in pregnancy. So it's a very long title, but in essence, it's this diagram. So if I just put this diagram, we would have got the funding without pages and pages of information. Really, it says we're looking for a cohort of 10,000 women who we recruit shortly after they give birth to their baby. And the women are in one of two groups. Either they've had the flu vaccine in pregnancy or they haven't had the flu vaccine in pregnancy. And we confirm their vaccination status with their provider. So we ask self-report and also confirm that. And we seek the permission to check if their children are subsequently notified to the state or territory health department with laboratory confirmed influenza 6 months later. So in short, it should really be a catch up. Hi, how you going? This is what it's about. No tests, just a bit of a chat, fill in a questionnaire, and we don't really need to do much else. We do give you another call 6 months later to do some other follow-up, but if you don't answer the phone, it doesn't really matter from our point of view because we're primarily interested in finding out whether your baby's ended up getting a notification of lab confirmed flu. So what I'm going to do today is talk to you about the current recommendations for flu, which Ian nicely has done already, so that should cut a few minutes off my talk. And I'm going to go through in a little bit of detail probably the pivotal study that demonstrated an impact against laboratory confirmed flu in a randomised control trial. So this is a study done in Bangladesh, which has lots of numbers and graphs and stuff, so I really like that. If you don't want to, if you just switch off if you don't want to listen to me when I get to there, and you can say, well, there's the paper in the New England Journal, I'll just read it myself, thanks very much. I'm then going to tell you about the FluMum study, and I'll briefly give you an outline of the design of that study. But again, you can switch off and just read the paper by Kerry-Ann O'Grady. And now I'm actually going to give you some results, and it's been fantastic to hear a lot of questions coming from the floor of people saying, well, what happens if somebody recommends it or doesn't recommend it, and who gets it and when they don't. And I've got some data that shows you what we've found so far. And I'm really going to have a bit of a discussion about the roles of GPs, midwives and obstetricians. I'm delighted to hear that there's midwives in the audience and that there are midwife immunisers in the audience. And one of the messages at the end of this, I think, is going to be there's a massive role here for midwives and a massive role not just in recommending vaccines but in actually giving them. And that'd be a good discussion point or an action point to come out of this at the end. My partner's an ex-midwife, so that's probably why I'm biased in that space. So, flu vaccine in pregnancy. So what does the handbook actually say about flu vaccine in pregnancy? Give it. So if that was the sort of recommendation, this would be a hell of a lot thinner book, really, wouldn't it? But in essence, that's what it says. And we've heard about the wording around, when it's recommended and critically, that this issue about any stage of pregnancy, and it's related to your risk of exposure to flu in the flu season. If we look back at previous handbooks, the 9th edition, a bit thinner, still said give it. And in fact, the edition before, the 8th edition, do you want to have a guess at what it said? Fantastic. So it's good. That's a bit of educational training. I did a little session on that. Said say things 3 times, Ross, and eventually people go, yeah, okay, I get it. But the short story is it's been a decade of national recommendations for flu vaccination in pregnancy, and yet uptake's been pathetic. I'll show you a little bit of data about what uptake's been, but it's been very difficult to get traction in giving flu vaccination in pregnancy. The World Health Organisation's Special Advisory Committee said if you're going to give flu vaccination in any public program, the one priority should be pregnant women. Now, when we think about flu vaccination as a public health program, most of you, if I gave you a little tick box as to what's the priority, would say people over 65. Or if you were being Tom Snelling, you'd say people over 50. So this is the paper from Bangladesh. And this wasn't the diagram in the paper, I drew that on the side of the paper, but basically it's 340 pregnant women recruited in Bangladesh in the third trimester. 172 were given flu vaccine in the third trimester, and the other 168 were given a pneumococcal vaccine in the third trimester. And through the paper they described that as the control group. But women in both groups actually got a vaccine. And then the babies of those women were then followed through for 5.5 months or 24 weeks. And they did active surveillance looking for influenza in those kids and collected a range of other information. So this is what got everybody excited. So here the blue line's the control. So if you're in this group and you didn't get a flu vaccine, there were 16 kids who had laboratory confirmed flu by the end of the observation period. So it's only going over one season in Bangladesh. This is the group whose mums got flu vaccine in pregnancy, and there are 6. So 6 cases versus 10 cases is really the basis. There's a lot of clever maths that goes behind it, but it just, basically that's what it is. We have 10 cases difference between the control group and the influenza vaccinated group. Becomes the basis of a lot of activity around immunisation policy. And it's probably why a number of people will say this is just one study. And we need more randomised control trials on more things before we launch into national programs. It's been a national program in Australia and many countries for a decade or more. So let's have a look at a bit more of the data. This is now looking at an outcome of respiratory illness with fever in the infants, so not lab confirmed flu. And if you look at the blue curves, basically you've got a peak coming up here and declining, and the thing that's of interest is for the vaccinated group, where mums had flu vaccine. It's still a peak, but it's just dampened a bit. So it's sort of consistent with an impact against flu, but in this case the measure is much less specific, so we've got respiratory illness with fever, so not all of that's going to be flu, but there is some dampening of that. This is a similar graph that compares the two groups, but just looks at the age and onset. And I suppose the take-home message for me when I looked at that is really, for most ages, the blue bar's higher than the orange bars, so that's consistent with less. Again, respiratory illness with fever. That's when I get really excited. Here's their big table with lots of numbers in it. And the key point here, if you're an epidemiologist, is you look at the influenza group and the control group, and they're pretty much seen for the same for the same period of time. So 870 versus 880 months. So the biostatisticians won't like me doing it, but after that I kind of forget about the denominator and just look at the number of cases because it's easier. So here I say, for the infants with respiratory illness with fever, there are 110 infants who had a respiratory illness with fever. And look at that, that's less than 153. So that's kind of a good thing. If you've got the flu vaccine, you'd want to see less. And this tells me that it's how much less? 29% less. So that's kind of the ballpark. I'm going to skip you through a few of those things that says, what's it tracking at? I'm giving a flu vaccine in pregnancy. Do I think it's going to prevent diarrhoea in the kids? I don't. The numbers are about the same. Good. So that's consistent. So it's having an impact in one area but not in another area. So that's a neat comparison. And this was what made the front page of the abstract. It said there's 6 cases in the influenza vaccinated group versus 16. That was a graph I showed you. So 63% reduction overall in lab confirmed flu. So 63% sounds a lot better than cut it down from 16 to 6. But mathematically it's statistically significant, if that's what gets your socks off. And then if we look at the mums, similar kind of thing, that we looked at the mums for the same sort of period of time, so I don't have to worry about that anymore. I can just look at what's above the line, the numerator. Mums with fever, there's 19 mums who had fever compared to 33 in the control group. So there was 43% reduction, but not statistically significant. See that little minus sign? So that means I can't get excited about that, even though I think that's interesting, that it's heading in the right direction. I didn't think there'd be any difference in diarrhoea, but there's 60 cases of diarrhoea versus 49, so there's fewer cases of diarrhoea. So should I get very excited about that? I wouldn't have been excited even if it was statistically significant. So it's 20% reduction with a minus value there. So there's a epidemiology 101 for you that tells you what whether this was useful or not. So I love that little table. Sorry about ramming it down your throat. Now I'm going to talk to you about the FluMum study. So here, this is a study we're aiming to get 10,000 mother-infant pairs. We thought at the initial stage when we were designing it that about 30% of women would be vaccinated in pregnancy, and that 2.3% of the infants of the mothers who hadn't had a vaccine in pregnancy would end up having a laboratory confirmed influenza notified to their state or territory health department. That seemed like a good idea at the time. I think I might have messed that number up in hindsight, but we'll wait and see how that goes. And all that was designed to have the power to determine if flu vaccine in pregnancy could prevent 40% or more of the flu in infants. And you remember the Bangladesh study said it was 68%, and all the other flu studies that you heard about earlier today say, generally around 50-60%, so we thought we were on the ballpark. So in order to demonstrate that, we need 10,000 women provided with 30% uptake if there's this amount of flu in the kids, so not much flu. And in essence, what we're trying to see is there's not much flu in the kids whose mums didn't get the vaccine, so we want to see even less flu in the mum of kids of mums who did get the vaccine, so there's not a lot of space to move. So the design is, and this ties in, there was a question earlier about when do I give flu vaccine, if it's November, December. The design was very much targeted around the expected risk of influenza in the infants. So this is our influenza season, roughly. We anticipate between May and August in the temperate climates. In Darwin, where I'm predominantly based, it's all year round, so we don't have to worry about it, but for Adelaide and other sites, it is an issue. And so we're aiming to recruit infants who are born between February and August. And so if you're born here, this is your last 3 months when we expect you to be exposed to influenza, and you can't get a vaccine yourself, so that's the only protection you can get. And then if you're born in May, you're going to be right through the middle of the season. So it's really, this is the concept of why we're trying to recruit kids. And I'll come to some data in a minute that'll show you what I think is a very important issue about when women are getting vaccinated. And I can give it away to you now actually, is most women aren't getting vaccinated in the first trimester when they should be, if they're coming into a flu season. So if you're pregnant in July, August, September, and there's flu raging around you, you should get the flu vaccine. And a lot of people are thinking, do I delay it? Do I hold on to it? Am I better to give it third trimester? Absolutely not. The handbook's very clear about that. If you first trimester and flu's around, get the vaccine. So what have we done so far? So these are big numbers. This is a joke that I didn't get any laughs out of that at all. 10,000 mums we're aiming to get that we've approached so far. Not all of those said that they wanted to be part of a study. And that's what happens when you allow informed consent. If it was compulsory, it'd be perfect. And I've just realised that's been recorded. I'm going to get in a lot of trouble for that. So we had 7,000 women consented to be part of the study, and there are some eligibility criteria that we want you to stick around. So we had a few who were ineligible and some women who changed their mind after originally consenting. That's okay. So we had 7,000 participants, and what we've seen out of those 7,000 at the moment is that 33% of those have self-reported that they've had a flu vaccine in pregnancy. We are subsequently going to validate that against medical records, but I'm actually a fairly trusting guy, and I reckon if you're pregnant, you pretty much know if you had a flu vaccine. But I'll do some statistical tests that'll come back next time and tell you that that's the way it is. I do have to tell you that this is very draft and preliminary data, and many of the co-investigators, who I should have acknowledged on the second slide, haven't had a chance to see this data because I did it this morning.
We trust you, we trust you.
So Helen believes it. She's a co-investigator and hasn't seen it yet. So about a third of the mums said they'd had a vaccine in pregnancy. But what's really interesting, if you break that down, or what I found really interesting, you might probably be bored to tears, but this is the first year we're looking at babies born in April and June, between April and June in 2012, and that was what their mum's coverage was. And then the babies born in this third quarter, July, September, so coming into the flu season, it's gone up to 36%. But when we look to the next year, we have each year from 2012, 2013, 2014, we've got gradually higher rates. But this really worries me. So these are these kids born in February, March, that virtually none of them have had their mums have had a flu vaccine. Now, most of those mums, if you're having your baby in the first quarter, you will have been pregnant in the first trimester right in the middle of the flu season. You would have been at the very peak component of the flu season. And it's a worry because I think one of the things that happens is we release flu vaccine in February, March, and there's a lot of attention around flu vaccination in February, March. When you get to kind of July, August, the flu's already here, and some people are going, oh, well, it's too late. I know in my workplace, if we hadn't got it, you had to go off and find it somewhere else. But it's a particularly serious issue for pregnant women. So here, these are women who, in their own pregnancy, would have been the most at risk, right in the midst of a flu season, and there's very low uptake. So this is a space, I'm going to plug on about this, but a space that I reckon midwives could really be the key players to get it done. So we've spoken to 7,000 mums, and we asked them a bunch of questions and paid them no money, and they did it for their own, for the greater good. 91% of mums described their own health during their pregnancy as good to excellent. Look at this, 95% of these 7,000 mums that we spoke to said that they'd had their first antenatal care by 16 weeks. Now, I just showed you that bugger all of those mums that had a vaccine at that point, and if they're in the flu season, that's a fantastic opportunity to make sure that those women get vaccinated. There was a comment earlier this morning about Aboriginal children and their access to health services, and they're seen 23 times on average in the first year of life, so they're there every second week. In our study, might be a biased sample, but that's a lot of women who've gone to antenatal care on time, and that's great. And to try to focus in on improving uptake at that point would be marvellous. Nearly everybody's heard about influenza, that's not surprising. 79% think influenza is serious. 16% have been to their GP during their pregnancy for a respiratory illness, and 2.6% of those women had actually had a test done. And that's the numbers if you're crazy nerd number-wise. But the infants, 30% of the infants had been to a GP with a respiratory illness, and 4.7%, so just under 5% of those had been tested. And that scared me a little bit because I'm hoping that 2.6% of these kids are going to end up with flu, this laboratory confirmed. Not that I want them to get flu, but just so that we can monitor it. And so it's unlikely at that kind of rate that if half of those are going to turn up positive with flu, we'll just have to watch it. But so that the presentation rate for GP is up around where I expected, but the testing rate's probably a bit lower. Well, maybe I should have done the sums a bit better. So we asked mums about their view of flu vaccines in pregnancy. And this is what mums said. So nearly half of the mums said that they think it stops you from getting flu in pregnancy. 80% said that they think you'll get less severe flu in pregnancy if you get it. And that was before Peter Richmond said that that's what will happen earlier this afternoon. Half of the mums said that they think flu vaccine could make you sick. And I think that's the kind of stuff, when you think about what happens, that's a pretty normal thing. So it's not that women are blindly just going with well, if you tell me it's good, it's good. People are aware of some concerns about safety. Interestingly, when they balance it up against the disease, that only 7% said that they thought the vaccine is worse than the disease. And that's people doing a risk-benefit process. So we asked all mums each of these questions. 45% thought it would stop their baby getting the flu. And it'd be nice if that turns out to be the vaccine effectiveness rate. But 20%, so 1 in 5 mums thought that the vaccine could harm their unborn baby. And that was exactly the comment that we just heard. And you can't expect in a conversation with people that everyone's going to be in favour of it or not in favour of it. That's a reasonable component, and it reminds us to be very clear and transparent about safety, the risks, and that things aren't without risk, but balancing the risk against the benefit. And that's a lifelong component, but that's been reflected in the data we've seen so far. So who talked to them about flu and pregnancy? So we had that question earlier. So how many people said somebody speak to them? Well, the mums said that only 28% of the mums said that a GP had spoken to them about flu and pregnancy. 11% of them said that an obstetrician had spoken to them about flu and pregnancy, so 1 in 10 mums. And 13% said that a midwife had spoken to them. Now, it's quite possible that these women lied. I've no doubt that every woman had a GP, an obstetrician and a midwife speak to them about flu in pregnancy. I'm just putting it out there. What we did ask though is we said, did anybody recommend that you get a flu vaccine in pregnancy? So 46% of the mums said a GP had recommended it, 20% said an obstetrician, and 20% said a midwife had recommended it. And then similarly, I was delighted somebody asked the question before and said, but what about, some women who go and the obstetrician says, no, don't get it, or midwife says, don't get it. So if you flip it over, we asked women, did anybody recommend that you not get a flu vaccine in pregnancy? And we asked about, parents and partners and a whole bunch of other people. But really, hardly anybody. So in 7,000 women, there's only 1.5% said that a GP had recommended they not get it. Fewer still where an obstetrician had said don't get it, and fewer still where a midwife had said don't get it. So it's going to happen, but what really happens mostly is that the majority of people don't say anything in relation to recommending you get a vaccine based on mother's self-report of whether it's real or not. But I believe them. So what happens if a GP does recommend you get flu vaccine in pregnancy? And we heard earlier reports of it being a 7-fold difference in interest in getting the vaccine. Well, here, if a GP had recommended that you get the vaccine, 6 out of 10 mums had actually had a vaccine in pregnancy compared to 2 out of 10. So a 3-fold difference, or in epidemiological terms, a relative risk of 2.7. So again, you can say 63% is more than 23%. So if I'm a GP, recommending that mum gets a vaccine does make a difference. Even better if you actually offer the vaccine there and then. So we've just asked about recommending. What about obstetricians? Do you reckon that'll make any difference if an obstetrician recommends you get the vaccine? Yeah, it does. Same kind of thing. What about if a midwife recommends you get the vaccine? Yeah, it does. So you don't need to do it. This is the sort of stuff you could have done without me doing all this work. So I'm just coming down to wrapping up the slot. So FluMum, usually when you do these talks, you start off telling people what your objective is and why you were doing it. And I thought I'd say it to the end just to keep you on your toes. So our primary objective is to assess the effectiveness of flu vaccine in pregnancy against lab-confirmed flu in infants. So that's too early for us to show that benefit. So we've still got another year of data collection, and we've got probably another 5 years of struggling with various data custodians to let them release our data. Not in South Australia, I must say. They're fantastic in South Australia. So if we get enough lab-confirmed flu, we'll be in a position to do that, but I'm not sure yet whether that will be the case. For secondary objectives, we want to look at vaccine uptake during pregnancy, and we want to look at predictors of uptake. And there are a range of things to look at, but already it's clear that uptake is pathetic, that there's a long way to go to improve it. And it's fantastic to hear about the sorts of initiatives, practical initiatives that are happening, and it's supposed to do it. I think from getting everybody to be looking at the evidence, recommending it, and preferably actually offering the vaccine for those who want to get it there and then is a critical way forward. And particularly, I'd be really keen to have a conversation either at the end of this session or afterwards to hear from midwives about whether such a concept of midwives being the vaccinators of choice would be a really useful thing to do. We will have some information about lab-confirmed flu during pregnancy. We certainly have already got GP consultations for that. And we will look at the effectiveness of flu vaccine in pregnancy. I think the lab-confirmed rates are going to be probably too low to have the power to do it, but it'll be just a check on the point estimate of whether it's lower. And hopefully that will also help to contribute information about flu vaccination in pregnancy. This study involving 6 sites around the country, 10,000 women, is the largest cohort study in the world looking at flu vaccination in pregnancy. And hopefully we'll be in a position to really contribute to the information. And I'd like us to then turn into a similar study looking at pertussis vaccination in pregnancy, and we're trying to come up with a quirky FluMum-like name, but I won't tell you what that is. So hopefully you're starting to understand some of the benefits or where the FluMum study might contribute to some of those benefits. Thank you very much.
Mine's just a quick one. How do you become part of your study?
Helen Marshall's just down the front here. We'd be delighted to have you. And not that we're allowed to recruit you because we know you're vaccinated, but it's nice to have you.
Lisa Benwood, I'm a GP obstetrician in a rural area, so probably don't pick come into your current cohort. I think I really enjoyed your presentation, Ross, and I think it's really important that we do get midwives, GPs, obstetricians all on board with this. As GPs, we are often the first port of call to confirm a pregnancy, and we often have a couple of visits in the first trimester. And it's often with GPs who don't have specialised obstetric skills initially, and they probably don't get to see the midwife in our practice probably until 3 to 4 months, 12 to 16 weeks. So I think it's really important to get that message out to when they first seen it, that if it isn't the flu season, that they do get immunised then. The whole GP community.
Yeah.
And I'll certainly be taking that back to my practice. The other problem, I think, is there is so much information and so many tests that are done in the first trimester discussing Down syndrome screening, other blood tests and that. And there's a lot of information overload that other important message gets just forgotten because of time factors. So we just need to be able to plan for that and make better use of our time. And having it in the orange book would be a really good reminder.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. That there's worldwide the evidence that GPs are a big influence in uptake of vaccine in pregnancy is a no-brainer. It's fantastic. So that concept for whoever sees mum first, or at any time, really looking at what's circulating flus around. If you're pregnant, get the flu vaccine. It's important then for mum to have a record of that flu vaccine being given, so she can tell her other providers. Be marvellous if we had some kind of a national record that would enable us to record adult immunisations. Somebody ought to write to Atagi about that. And I think that's really a really key component. And I can give you a little anecdote. My daughter's due to have her first baby at the end of November, so I'm going to be a grandfather, which officially makes me elderly. And she knows what I do, and she keeps telling me every time she goes to whatever the provider, the obstetrician, the GP, or the midwife, comes home and said, "Anybody speak to you about flu?" No.
I'm Claire Glover and I'm a midwife, and I'm very proud to have been one for 44 years. This whole, I actually have just retired as Associate Professor of Midwifery from Flinders University. But this has been on my agenda for quite some time now, because I firmly believe it needs to be in undergraduate programs, not only for midwives but also for medicine and whatever. I was responsible for writing the eligible midwife first course in Australia, leading to prescribing, and it's certainly been something that's been addressed in that course. Now that's for a specific group of midwives who are eligible, they've got a Medicare number and they've got the access to the PBS. That's one group. But you've got the others that are coming out that need to actually have this. I mean, I've got to say yes, hurry up and get your data out, hurry up and get a YouTube and present to everybody a simple way that you present to. The amusing way, the simple way, but the understandable way that you just put that data together. Because I think if you can get that through to women, they do have a choice. We have to, I'm sorry, this whole notion of ethics, and someone's speaking on that in a minute. I mean, women have a choice. They have a choice to have a caesarean, they have a choice to have a normal birth, they have a choice to have immunisation, they have a choice not to. But we need to be able to be proactive, have the data, and then just keep at the women. But saying where to have it is really important. So, you've got the actual figures there that show that. I'm right behind you. I'm chair of the scientific committee for the Australian College of Midwives, and it's actually on our agenda. So please rest assured that midwives are starting to address it.
Marvellous, thank you. And I think it's very clear. I think that the point you made in that it's critical that women do have the choice, and what's critical is that they actually get the option to say no. I think too many women actually aren't even getting asked. So that's what the ethics is about. This is not about making it compulsory or not pushing it. Give people the opportunity to say no, And if people say no, that's fantastic.